Chloe, why are you in bed? Well, Chloe threw out her back. In this video, we're going to be starting off Pride Month just a little bit early with a video about the TERFs, or the trans-exclusionary radical feminists. This is a hate movement which denies trans identity and opposes trans liberation. And there's essentially nothing that I can say from that angle that hasn't already been covered by some excellent trans YouTubers. For example, ContraPoints, Philosophy Tube, Jammy Dodger, Vera Wild or Council of Geeks, Jessie Gender, and Cat Black. I would highly recommend going to their channels and seeing their work because I'm not going to be repeating their arguments here. But while I don't have much to add to that particular conversation, I do have a thing or two to say about the fact that they insist on using lesbian identity as a shield and a defense for their bigotry. The basic argument goes, trans-identified males are not real women, just creepy men. Lesbians, on the other hand, are an esteemed class of people defined by their sexual orientation and cannot be compelled to date trans-identified males. Doing so to validate their sick fetish is a hate crime against lesbians, and haven't we suffered enough? Now, this line of reasoning is nonsense. I'm a lesbian, and I think that trans women are women. I disavow TERF ideology, and I resent the fact that they use me as a human shield against critiques. And I get that plenty of TERFs themselves are lesbians, but hashtag not all lesbians, you know? But the thing about having more privilege than trans women, at least along this axis, is that my quiet disapproval of a system has the same political effect as quiet approval of the status quo. So I'd like to dedicate this video to women, to feminists, to lesbians, and to trans liberation. I hate this question so much because there's a simple answer that's wrong, and then there's a complicated answer that's only slightly less wrong. We went over this question in my Women in Literature class back in college, and oh boy, there's a way to instantly be wrong about everything, and that is taking a 300 level gender studies class without any of the recommended prerequisites. So I was sitting there with a lot of people who had taken the 1 in 200 level gender studies classes, whereas I was taking my first class towards a literature minor which had no prerequisites. So I can definitely feel for how out of one's depths one might feel trying to answer this question. But let's give it a shot. Since it's my YouTube video, let's start off with what makes me feel like a woman. Painting my nails, curling my hair, wearing high heel shoes, dresses, skirts, and makeup, reading books, having a close-knit group of female friends, that time of the month, getting massage, wearing SPF moisturizer, plucking my eyebrows. Not that I've done that in a while. Owning 2 beautiful cats, drinking a gin and tonic, quilting, sleeping in, working in museums, working as a teacher, doing Pilates, even when I pull my back, using bar soap that smells like fruit, using reusable grocery bags and water bottles, taking naps, taking baths, and trying to grow out my hair, but only until June rolls around. Now these things fall into a few different categories. There are aesthetic ones, like using bath soap that smells like fruit and painting my nails. Some of them are social, like working in a female-dominated field and having a large group of female friends. Some of them are very traditional, like quilting. And some of them are based in stereotypes, like taking naps. But at the same time, there are things about me that make me feel less of a woman. In my late teens and early 20s, a lot of my female friends started taking birth control, and I didn't, because I'm gay. The ritual of popping pills, or the fluency with which they could talk about their implants, was at once something that was intrinsically and innately feminine, and yet something that I was excluded from. There are other things too, which also don't map onto my concept of femininity, but also don't give me the same level of unease. For example, from a young age, I knew that very short hair on a black woman was a feminine haircut, whereas extremely short hair on a white woman wasn't. Different rules apply to different kinds of women. And while it would be disingenuous to say that black women aren't held to white standards because they are, it's also true that black children tend to be raised by black parents to be black, whereas queer children tend to be raised by straight parents to be straight. But importantly, none of these things are predetermined objective measures of either femininity or womanhood. It's really just a jumble of signifiers. For example, about 100,000 women have Swier's syndrome. This is a genetic irregularity, which means that somebody has XY chromosomes but develops as a biological woman, except that she has no gonads at all, just a little bit of scar tissue where the ovaries might have been. She develops as a girl until puberty would have happened, except that without ovaries she doesn't go through puberty. Now, we have hormones that we can give somebody to make sure that they go through puberty. We can give her estrogen to match her social and physical attributes, or we can give her testosterone to match her XY chromosomes. If chromosomes were the only thing that mattered, we would give her testosterone. But that's not the only thing that matters. Sociology, biology, and internal sense of gender also matter. So even though she has XY chromosomes, you would give her estrogen. Now, Swier's syndrome is pretty rare, but it's not the only irregularity of the 23rd chromosomes. And that doesn't even begin to touch on the fact that outside of genetics, primary and secondary sex characteristics vary wildly. In cases of ambiguous birth sex, the child's physiology is often reconstructed to be female. Now, how an infant is supposed to be able to make an informed decision about their gender and their surgeries, I don't know, but I digress. If the child is raised as a girl and never knows that she's anything but a girl, does her ambiguous birth sex make her any less of a woman? No. At this point, some people would grant these exceptions and start to bolster a third argument, which is suffering. What it means to be a woman is to be ground down by the patriarchy. If you weren't catcalled from age 14 on, you don't know what it's like to be a woman. Actually, funny story, until I was in my early 20s, I legit thought that every time a guy drove past and either whoop whooped or honked his horn, I thought that the whoops were he got very, very good news, like he got a job or graduated, or like he was cheering for himself, right? And then the honking the horn, I don't know, I thought his hand slipped. So, I didn't internalize any of that. Guess I'm not a woman. But surely this model puts men at the center of a woman's identity in a way that women are not central to men's identities. Is Wonder Woman less of a woman because she was raised only around other women? More broadly, it makes oppression a right of womanhood. If feminism works and someday we're all equal, then what does that mean for our gender? Oppression as a prerequisite turns equality into an existential threat against a feminine gender. But that can't be right because there have been matriarchal societies that certainly weren't genderless. So what does it mean to be a woman? The definition that I like to use because it feels the most apt is that woman is a concept model. It's a cluster of behaviors, appearances, and social roles, some of which will map broadly onto the experiences of most women. It's essentially a long list of women are more likely to, but don't necessarily need to, statements. And not everything on this list is going to be equal in importance. For me and my gender identity, wearing pretty feminine shoes is more important than the act of getting facials, and both of them are less important than having a strong cluster of female friends. But all three of these things map onto my identity as a woman. But not everything about this model is so straightforward. In fact, there are things about this model which even seem paradoxical. Take, for example, that women are adults, by definition. Adults are supposed to be self-sufficient, but many women choose not to be. This isn't to say that they don't work or aren't full partners, just that the kind of work that they do pursuing an artistic career, raising children, working part-time at a company that can't afford to hire a full-time employee, community organizing, etc., wouldn't pay the bills if they had to rely on it. Does being dependent on someone else make their work have less value or make them less of an adult? Well, a lot of women have to get used to the idea of not bringing home a paycheck if that's something they're used to. But no, of course not. Independence is no more an intrinsic facet of adulthood than dependence is an intrinsic facet of womanhood. Let's revisit the oppression question from a slightly different angle. While oppression isn't necessarily what makes a woman, the political category of woman is necessary to fight against oppression on the basis of sex, or gender presentation, or perceived gender. Someone can be the victim of misogyny without being a woman. All it takes is for somebody to map feminine characteristics onto how they perceive that person, and then target them with sexist attitudes. It doesn't make this person a woman, but it might incentivize them to fight against sexism. So what does it mean to fight sexism? Back in high school, some feminists decided to host a stomp on sexism during lunch. They had a ton of sexist advertisements that they spread out on the floor and invited people to come and stomp on those advertisements. Now, does this stop the advertisements from running? No. Does this stop these companies from making money? No. Stomp on sexism was purely performative, and that's not a bad thing. Hosting this event in a public place means that a lot of people saw it and had to think about it. I know I, for one, was honestly pretty angry and confused about the whole thing. What exactly was it about thin and conventionally attractive white women that was supposed to be so sexist? I was a young, thin, conventionally attractive white woman, and I didn't feel harmed by it. And how exactly is a woman eating a sandwich sexualizing her? I got pretty angry at the whole thing because of how stupid I thought it was, because I didn't understand it at the time. Now, part of why I didn't understand is because I was raised in a way that insulated me from any real instances of sexism until I got to college, which is a good thing. But another big part of this is that I didn't yet understand the difference between interpersonal sexism and systemic sexism. That is to say, the difference between somebody doing a sexist thing to you and the general, overall societal grind of low-key sexism that affects everyone. You might never even know it was there if it wasn't for the statistics and the sociology which reveals it, which, incidentally, is why fascists hate sociology. Now, let's take a look at an example. Let's say you work in an office and you have a sexist coworker who likes to talk about how lazy he thinks women are, and a few, maybe sexist coworkers who are willing to listen to him. Well, one day you decide, enough is enough. I'm going to confront him about this. And after that, he no longer says anything about how lazy women are in your presence. It's an improvement, to be sure, but does it solve the problem? No. He hasn't stopped criticizing women, he just does it where women can't hear and can't tell him to stop. Because silence around you doesn't mean silence around everyone, and if there are people still willing to listen to his opinions and willing to hear him out, and if those people construct an office narrative and that narrative is understood by the people who are in charge of promoting people, well, you might lose a promotion because somebody doesn't like women, even if you never have to hear about it. This is why we need systemic support, not just individuals willing to stand up for themselves. Now, admittedly, this is a bit of a controversial opinion to have within feminist circles. Old school feminists tend to think in terms of powering through anything. My favorite example of this is when a friend who's significantly older than me was in graduate school earning her PhD. She had her son the same week that she had to turn in her dissertation. because her advisor was a feminist and thought that women are strong and therefore can and should take on the world. And sure, I get that having a baby wasn't exactly part of the whole earning a PhD bargain, but come on! Most new moms can just about manage to nap and maybe shower. Expecting her to be productive enough to write a dissertation that week is madness. I mean, props to her for having gotten it done, but the expectation is madness. Can you imagine if a male advisor had held her to the exact same standard? So you say that women are equal to men? Well, then prove it. Write your dissertation the same week you have your child. I did. I mean, the tone of the two statements is very different, but the expectation is identical. One might very well ask whether there's any difference between unreasonable feminist expectations and unreasonable patriarchal expectations, as long as neither one offers reasonable and equitable accommodations. Younger feminists tend towards this approach, asking for more equity in the form of accommodations to account for the fact that lots of women have different things going on in the background, making access to opportunities more accessible to more women, not fewer. A great example of this sort of grassroots sociological feminism is the #MeToo movement. This was a way of drawing awareness to the sexual misconduct of powerful men who otherwise would never have been brought to account. Between awareness and several instances of actual justice, and when there was no justice, awareness of that injustice, this is a step forward towards a larger goal of equity and equality within certain fields. It also says we stand with survivors of sexual assault and against toxic workplace environments, and we will share these stories, and people will know. There will be accountability. However, there are a lot of older feminists who don't like #MeToo, because it parades the fact that young feminists don't have the self-empowerment to say no to powerful men. Oh, #you too, huh? Well, I guess this next generation just isn't cut out for feminism, because no real feminist would have traded sex to be in the movies. So we've already discussed topics of what is a woman and why is feminism necessary, as well as the fact that feminism isn't a monolith. All feminists agree that women are equals of men, but there's considerable disagreement as to how are we supposed to achieve parity economically, politically, and socially. There's so much infighting within feminist circles, and that actually brings us to the main topic of this video. The modern feminist movement began in the 1960s and expanded in influence and efficacy throughout the 60s and 70s. This took the form of advocating for very specific rights. For example, to have job advertisements not specify the sex and gender of the applicant. Several of these advances, like the woman's right to own a credit card in her own name, are so normal now that it's hard to imagine a time before that was available. Other items which are thematically linked, like the woman's right to have 12 weeks of unpaid maternity leave, didn't come about for 2 more decades. And still others, like girls' and women's right to play sports in high school and college, were decided on in the 70s, but have been continually debated to this day. So this is an ongoing and continuously evolving conversation, and if we're going to talk about modern-day TERFs, we have to talk about lesbian feminism. And if we're going to talk about lesbian feminism, we have to talk about Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan is best known for her book The Feminine Mystique, which details the existential ennui of a housewife in the 50s and 60s. In 1966, she organized the National Organization for Women, which was a civil rights advocacy group to advance women's liberation. In 1969, she made it official policy that lesbians could not join now because of the Lavender Menace. It would taint the feminists' esteemed reputation and scare off other straight women from joining. She also didn't like that lesbians might have different needs and therefore a different agenda than straight women. One of these women who was kicked out of NOW was Rita Mae Brown, who until this point had held a leadership position in NOW. In response to this ousting, and not being taken seriously by gay men and homosexual groups, a few things happened in quick succession. In May of 1970, the very next year, Rita Mae Brown and her new group, Radicalesbians, crashed the Congress to Unite Women, got up on the stage, and read off their thesis, The Woman-Identified Woman. And with this, lesbian feminism was born. But keep the radical in mind, because we'll see it again. In January of 1972, the Furies, a 12-woman commune in Washington, D.C., was formed. Among them was Rita Mae Brown. Other lesbian separatist communes would be created throughout the 70s and early 80s. Lesbian feminism certainly was lesbians doing feminism, but it was also so much more than that. It was a political response to the idea, held even among feminists, that women's lives had to revolve around men's. And that's essentially in line with the radical feminists of the same era, saying that if women are to be equal, then society has to be remade, because the machinery of society was intended to keep men on top, and it will only ever do that one thing. Unlike modern lesbians of our own era, lesbian feminists weren't necessarily attracted to other women. Rather, they viewed lesbianism as the height of feminist praxis. Here in D.C., the Furies only lasted 18 months, but their writing continues to influence feminism to this day. Most importantly, lesbianism is no longer seen as something extrinsic to or incompatible with feminism. As I've already outlined, there are important historical reasons to connect radical feminism with lesbianism. One doesn't have to be both in order to be one or the other, but they do tend to go hand in hand for several conceptual reasons. It's no coincidence, then, that modern-day trans-exclusionary radical feminists will use lesbians as a shield for their worldview. After all, haven't lesbians suffered enough at the hand of mainstream feminism? This is 1969 all over again. Except no. Lesbians, at least in the West, at least in feminist circles, are pretty well established as their own legitimate thing. And while I've been cagey about my sexual orientation in some circles, feminist groups aren't that place. In fact, feminist groups and LGBT groups tend to be more accepting of lesbians. In fact, if we the lesbians had learned the right lesson all those years ago, we would be better allies to trans women in our various overlapping communities. It's the same basic hatred of she whomst is not like us that kept lesbians out of NOW, that kept lesbians out of NOW, that kept lesbians out of NOW, and now keeps trans women out of women's spaces. And yes, I do mean sports clubs and changing rooms, but more importantly, I mean women-dominated careers, girls' summer camp, women's colleges, and women's social clubs. I said back at the beginning of this video that one of the things that I find most important to being a woman is having a strong sense of female friendship. That's something that should be readily available for any woman who wants it. Even the N-logs and the pick-me's eventually come around to wanting female friendship. And it's so much harder for women in the margins. Any margins. And the idea of putting someone in said margins in order to protect your own little enclave isn't good enough. While I was researching for this video, I watched several Magdalene Burns videos. You might recognize the name Magdalene Burns from a reference in Just Kidding Rolling's essay TERF Wars. J.K. touted her as a brave young lesbian, but she was angry and hateful and mean. And this anger wasn't just targeted at trans women either. She tore into Stevie Bobby and Ariel Scarcella and any other lesbian who wasn't in lockstep with her angry, hateful worldview. So why would I bring this person up? Well, one of the recurring themes in her videos caught my attention. She brought up the idea of dating being exclusionary, and that other people have no right to tell her who she can date. And you know what? She's right. Nobody has the right to tell her who to date, and nobody has to date someone just because they fall into the broader category of people they're attracted to. Personally, I don't particularly care for dating extroverts because, in my experience, they can be a bit much. But you know what else is true? Is that she doesn't get to police other people's identities. Or at least, she shouldn't be able to. Magdalene Byrne's rhetoric is still being used as fodder for anti-trans legislation in the UK, even years after her death. And that's why, after weeks of going back and forth trying to decide whether or not this is a good look, I'm arguing against a recently dead girl. Because she was wrong, and because her ideas are still being used to make trans lives harder. Another channel which interestingly came up in this research was the Heritage Foundation. One panel in particular caught my attention because of its array of unusual speakers. Most of them were liberal, some of them were lesbians, and they, the host, and the audience all acknowledged how strange it was that they were giving a presentation at the Heritage Foundation. But as the host said, it's important to make allies, even if it's on a single issue. The theme of this panel was gender confirmation, specifically the fact that children were transitioning without parental consent. Several of these panelists mentioned that they had tried to bring their concerns to left-wing spaces first, and they had not been given a platform. They even made a point of mentioning that all of their other views are left-wing, and I suppose by extension they figured that all of their views must be left-wing, even when this one is being hosted at the Heritage Foundation. And yet, even while feeling this dissonance, they never took the time to say, hey, wait a minute, why am I throwing my lot in with these people? If we agree on nothing else, and if I'm used to thinking of myself as a liberal person, then why is this one idea of mine not aligning with the rest of my worldview? And to be fair, I'm sure lots of people did. Certainly a couple of people on a panel don't negate the thousands of people who take a step back and consider other points of view. But their existence on that stage does show that this is not an intuitive process for everyone, and that's why I'm calling it out here. Magdalene Byrne feared that including trans women in a definition of women would mean opening her dating pool to include absolutely everybody and would erase lesbian identity. The existential threat here is that any lesbian who includes trans women in her definition of women erases her own identity. But after thinking about this, I have to ask, erased by who? Who are the lesbian cops who tell you who you can and can't date? It's not a thing. And even if it was a thing, assigned cop at birth. I mean, all cops are bastards. Even the lesbian cops, especially the lesbian cops. I honestly do not care what TERFs think of me. If they say that I can't be a lesbian, well, I say that they can't engage in good faith with a good deal of modern queer theory, and I think I got the good end of that bargain. This is to say that I stand to gain nothing, personally, socially, or politically, by subscribing to a TERF worldview, and everything to gain by standing with trans liberation. TERFs, you don't speak for me. Stop using my identity as a shield against critiques of your stupid ideas. And for everybody else, happy Pride 2021. Oh, I have to sit up now. Ugh.